All right, so today I am with Jake Pippin from Bonterra Winery, and we're going to talk a little bit about Bonterra and the wines that they produce, but a little bit more importantly, and focus perhaps on sort of, where Bonterra fits in the world of viticulture, the actual grape growing and farming practices that you guys use. So, Jake, if you don't mind, just actually introduce yourself a little bit, tell us
Yep.
where you fit in the winery, and then we'll talk about the winery itself.
Yeah. So my name is Jake Pippin. I am the portfolio manager for what we call the Origins collection. So a variety of wines from our three origins, which include our biodynamic wines from Bonterra. And but I dabble in all sorts of things with education presentations, things like that, when it comes to the full suite of wines that we have, from Bonterra to Caser del Diablo to Don Melchor to our biodynamic single vineyards.
Cool. So just to explain that a little bit, Bonterra is a winery that is owned by whom, and then by whom?
So Bonterra is a winery owned by Fetzer Vineyards. So it was kind of a natural extension of the Fetzer family's, kind of desire to really invest in sustainable agriculture back in the 80s. But I'll get to that. But Fetzer Vineyards is owned by the Chilean winery called Conchitoro, and they purchased Fetzer, Bonterra, and the related brands back in 2011. And since then, Conchitoro has been a large proponent of sustainable agriculture. They have their own kind of Bonterra-esque winery called Connoisseur down in Chile, as well as the world's largest biodynamic vineyards with Emiliana. So it was a really natural extension for them to, seek out and work and purchase Fetzer, along with all of the practices and that Bonterra has become well known for.
Right. I've actually been to Chile and been to Connoisseur.
Excellent. Okay.
So I've seen the biodynamic practices and the viticultural and winemaking practices there. This was in 2009, so I think before the acquisition of Fetzer.
Correct.
But the practices are basically the same. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. Where is Bonterra located?
So Bonterra is located kind of right in between the towns of Hopland and Ukiah in Mendocino County.
Okay,
so Mendocino County has always been the home of the Fetzer family, Bonterra, but Bonterra specifically is located in a little box canyon, kind of up in the foothills, about 20 miles inland from the coast as the crow flies.
Yeah.
And a box canyon is essentially a three-sided canyon with one entrance, hence the box. And we're just tucked right back in there. It used to be an old sheep farm, used to be an old cherry orchard. So this land has kind of always been under some form of agricultural practice. It's just recently that we've converted everything to, not even everything, but a small portion of it to vineyards.
Right. So I would imagine, and we're going to talk about biodynamics here in a second, but being in that box canyon probably has some good benefits as far as, the requirements to fulfill biodynamics, because you don't really have probably a lot of neighbors in that canyon, I'm guessing.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we have a few, but it's pretty much just us.
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is you can kind of control the environment a little bit more. You're protected from influences from neighbors with, drifting, products drifting over with the wind or whatnot. You've got that natural protection, so it makes it easier. So
Exactly.
So you're in Mendocino, north of really Sonoma and Napa, so Northern California.
Correct.
And when did Bonterra really kind of become an entity, a wine producing entity?
So 1987 was when Bonterra started, and it was about 20 years after Fetzer was founded. So
Right.
It, as I alluded to, it really evolved out of an organic farm that the Fetzer family had on the property that they used as part of their culinary center. So they had a culinary center. They wanted to use organic vegetables. The Fetzer family was part of that kind of back to the land movement in the 60s up into Mendocino. And their ethos was, really, as Barney Fetzer described it, what's good for the land is good for the grape. What's good for the grape is good for the wine. And
Right.
that very basic sort of premise really guided their eventual embrace of organic viticulture. And it's not that they didn't embrace it before, it just didn't have a name.
Right.
And, organic viticulture as we know it nowadays, that wasn't the saying really in the 60s with a title and a name and certifications. It just didn't exist.
Right.
And biodynamic even more so.
Yeah, no, biodynamics is something that really was kind of, codified, if you will, back in the 1920s. But, from a global perspective for farming, it really didn't kind of take off until much later. And obviously organics We can kind of debate whether or not it's been used as a marketing tool more than actually anything, but there is a big difference between the organic. So maybe real quick, just tell us,
Yeah,
if you don't mind, the difference between what an organic farm how they would function or what they would look like versus a biodynamic farm.
sure. So they're similar, but they're very different. So essentially, organic and an organic facility like ours requires a certification by a certifying body. So in our case, it's the CCOF, the California Collective Organization of Farmers, and they essentially certify not only our winemaking facility but our vineyards themselves. And so we produce what we call organically grown wine. So our wine itself is not organic wine, but the grapes going into it are organic, which I know can be a little confusing, but in the eyes of the USDA, basically what that means is our wines, which are made from organically grown grapes, have slightly higher than the 100 part per million sulfite requirement to be considered an organic wine.
Okay.
And sulfites, we could have a whole debate about that, and there's a lot of opinions out there, but essentially, in a nutshell, sulfites act as a preservative. They're naturally occurring, and winemakers will add them to, in addition to what is naturally produced, to help stabilize a wine when it is on the shelf, so it can last longer than just a few weeks or a month.
Right.
Biodynamic, on the other hand, is, and I use this phrase kind of tongue in cheek, it's organic on steroids, except there's no steroids involved. Organic is generally certified by a state agency. It can go all the way up to a federal agency in the States, but biodynamic, on the other hand, is really certified by and organized by Demeter. And Demeter is an international nonprofit that certifies not only products, but land, agriculture, everything. And it's not just associated with the wine industry, but there are considerably more stringent requirements. So for organic, for example, we can't use pesticides. There's no Roundup. There's no anything like that. We want to, use naturally occurring products to, mitigate whatever issues come along in the vineyard, be it, a fungus or a, insect infestation, whatever it might be. We use naturally occurring products or beneficial bugs, ladybugs, to, take care of a problem. Biodynamics, on the other hand, really breaks that down into much more stringent kind of parts. The largest component of that is everything that organic has, biodynamic has, but biodynamic, takes it another step further. So we have to set aside at least 25% of our land to a natural state. That we can't, if we have a 100-acre vineyard or 100-acre plot of land, only 75 acres of that could be planted to grapes. The rest has to stay in a natural state to foster biodiversity. And in addition to that, we have to have an animal component that acts as part of our practices. In our case, we use sheep, and not only do sheep help fertilize, but they mow for us in the winter. They go through and they pick up all the grapes that we left behind that didn't make it. They love it. They get to run the vineyard for the winter. Right. But it also helps us naturally fertilize, but it doesn't compact the soil. Whereas if you're running a tractor through there year in, year out, that soil starts to get compacted. It starts to become a less ideal home for beneficial bugs, insects, bacteria in the soil, fungi in the soil, that is going to act as sort of a natural protectant of our land. We want to foster biodiversity, and that's one way that we do it. Right. In addition to that, gets into the whole, practices about, the phases of the moon and, the cow horn. I mean, to some people, biodynamics can get really woo-woo, but it's all really based in science. I mean, Dr. Rudolf Steiner, that developed biodynamics back in the 1920s, and these practices, was really looking for a sustainable way to grow vegetables. He didn't really buy into that, what came out of World War I, that, massive amount of ammonia and other chemically man-made fertilizers to boost crops, because it's good for a little bit of time, but what about 20 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later? It's not sustainable.
Yeah, no, I mean, my understanding of Steiner is he kind of grew up originally in a rural area during what was essentially the Industrial Revolution, saw the changes that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and created this sort of philosophy based on really what he had, from the more rural and traditional farming areas that he had come from, and applied them after, it was a reaction after to this huge increase in using these agrochemicals to, for fertilizers that people kind of quickly realized, like you just said, we're not going to sustain the land. They were good for growing a few years worth of crops, but really tired it out because you were just kind of dumping all this, not natural stuff on it. So biodynamics is his reaction, or his answer in a broad sense, to kind of go back to creating that self-sustaining ecosystem, essentially, that a farm would have been, prior to the industrial revolutions that happened in the 1800s.
Exactly. And that's a great way to kind of succinctly say it. It's basically a farm, and the way that farm was before the industrial revolution, before agrochemicals kind of poured in. It's a closed loop system. Our inputs to our system are the outputs from the system. We try to create a very self-sustaining, biodiverse environment that, fosters whatever product grapes in this case. We want to benefit the grapes, but we also want to benefit everything else that uses that environment to live and exist, that also help us.
Right. Yeah. So just in a nutshell, the difference is really kind of maybe in a couple sentences, I think, between organics is you have a list of inputs that you can use. That's, as long as it's approved and it's on the organic list, you're okay. But biodynamics is, well, you don't really have to have inputs, or you shouldn't have to have inputs, because we sort of develop a way to self-sustain using things like compost, using the sheep to kind of recirculate the energy that's in the ground and the plants and everything back through to manure to help kind of fertilize everything. Okay, cool. So
Exactly.
so you guys at Bonterra, you have I think you told me you have 5 farms or 5 properties that you work with?
Correct. So we have 5 different ranches that we farm as biodynamic ranches. And, we call them a ranch because there is an animal component to it. We actually, just about a year ago, we got cows to help with our compost program. We don't let them run amok in the vineyard because they just destroy things.
Right.
But, they are an animal component that is very beneficial to our composting program that we then use in the vineyard. But we have the 5 ranches. We have nearly 3,000 acres in all that we farm biodynamically.
Right. So you have all those vineyards that you farm biodynamically. Do you have any other vineyard sourcing besides that? Because Bonterra is not, is all the fruit that you produce go into Bonterra and that's it? Or do you have other farms you work with, or other ranches you work with?
We have other ranches that we work with as well. So, we have 3 single vineyard biodynamic wines that only come from 3 of the ranches that we farm. But Bonterra we have other organic vineyards that we also farm that we just haven't converted, which is a 3-year process to convert from organic to biodynamic. That, for our Chardonnay, for example, the original Sundial Ranch from Fetzer, there along the Russian River in Mendocino. I should have worn my shirt. I have an old Sundial shirt.
Stocking the shelves with Sundial Chardonnay.
Oh yeah, that is one of our organic vineyards that we've converted to organics, but we haven't yet converted all the way to biodynamics. However, it does abut one of our vineyards called the Roost for our Roost Chardonnay. So we kind of split it a little bit, and we like to just see how things go.
Right. And so in Mendocino, you guys are growing pretty much common grape varieties that we would all be familiar with. Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay for the whites. I think, any other whites that you guys produce? Those are the ones
we do actually. Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay are the kind of standard ones. We also make a Viognier in limited quantities. We also grow Marsanne and Roussanne as well in our Butler Vineyard, which is kind of way up at the top of the Box Canyon at about 2,200 feet in elevation. We don't, do any single bottlings of that, unfortunately. I keep asking Jeff, I'm like, Jeff, please make a Marsanne Roussanne blend. I think that'd be really killer. And we also make a dry muscat as well that we grow up in our, which we actually do bottle. You can buy it on the website, but we don't sell it to any of our wholesalers. We just make a pretty small quantity.
All right, that's cool. So those grapes like Marsanne, Roussanne, actually Muscat and Viognier, those are all grapes that relate back to like the Rhone River region in France.
Exactly.
Pretty durable from a climate point of view, because they're used to being grown in relatively warm and fairly dry climate conditions like in the Rhone. So it seems like it suit biodynamic farming. You're probably not doing irrigation, and you're dealing with climate change. Mendocino does have elevation, so you get some cooling temperatures, but there is some of that also in the Rhone Valley. So it kind of makes sense. And I think you also, now changing over to red grapes, we'll talk about that. You guys grow Syrah and some other Rhone varietals too, as well as Merlot, Cabernet, and Zinfandel, and some traditional varietals, right?
Correct. Yeah. We have your host of, classic California varieties, Cabernet, Zinfandel, Pinot Noir, Merlot. But, in addition to that, particularly in our Butler and McNabb ranches, we're growing Syrah, we're growing Mourvedre, we're growing Grenache, and we're even growing Petit Syrah. I like to say that some of our blends, because the two biodynamic wines that we have are reds that are blends, is essentially a California Rhone blend and a California Bordeaux blend. And why I call them California blends is because each one of them has a little bit of Petit Syrah in there. Jeff Saihaki, our winemaker, is a big fan of Petit Syrah, just to kind of add that tannic backbone, little color as well.
Yep.
And because of that, they're not traditional Rhone or Bordeaux blends, but they sometimes get 3-4% Petit Syrah in there.
Modern Cali interpretations.
Exactly.
Yeah, that works.
We actually even have some Malbec up there as well. It's a pretty diverse little vineyard.
So,
for example,
so I'm just going to say, does Malbec get? Where does that get blended? Does it go into like Cabernet or one of the other wines that we might come across?
Yeah, so it goes into our wine called the McNabb, which is our Bordeaux blend. So classic Bordeaux varieties: Cab dominant, Cabernet Sauvignon dominant, a little Cab Franc, Petit Verdot, Petit Syrah, and then a little Malbec. Nice. Each year it's a little different, but it's always at least 50% Cab Sauv.
I guess the last question I have is really about climate change and how you guys are dealing with that. Obviously, something that's been very, very much in the forefront of topics lately, and we've seen California fires, floods, rain, snows, everything seems to happen these days in California. And so with biodynamic and organic viticulture, where you're not able to sometimes use some of the more modern vehicles like maybe irrigation, things like that, how are you guys dealing with the stresses, I guess, of all of this stuff and the biggest impact I think with climate change really is just the incremental increases of the overall temperature every year, drying things out, which then relates to that.
Yes, it is. There is a myriad of problems that we face. A lot of people think that, it's always going to be like insect or pest related. And, honestly, if you have a healthy, diverse ecosystem like we've created in our ranches, that's never really an issue. It's things like fire. And, for example, as things continue to dry out in a traditional vineyard, and I'm making generalizations here, but those tend to be very water dependent vineyards, and there's no riparian area. It's essentially a very dry vineyard that you have to irrigate, and there's no sort of natural green protective border around this, which we're required to have with part of that 25% riparian natural area set aside. That acts as a fire buffer. We, by able to increasing soil fertility, increasing our biodiversity not only in our soil but in our surrounding area, that increases the water content and the water sort of storage capacity of our ranches, thus really helping mitigate either big spikes when we have droughts in California, or in just if a fire does come through, it's much less likely to burn,
right?
Than an environment that's just been cleared and starved of water, for the exception of a crop that you want to grow.
Right.
And that acts as a really natural, there's not only benefits to the product and crop we're growing, but to the greater environment that surrounds us. One of the avenues that we've taken, particularly water is such a big component to this, particularly in California, and its boom and bust cycles, where, if it doesn't snow in the Sierra and have a good snowpack, there's going to be ramifications on down the line, from fire to drought to, lack of water or decreasing water table in the valleys, et cetera, because it's not replenished. Right. We've invested in a lot of, water recapture and just water sort of mitigation techniques. We have this giant, I call it the pit, and it's full of these little tiny red earthworms. Not your traditional like earthworms you would use fishing, but we take our must, we take our compost and our, everything when it goes to a crusher destemmer, we put it in there. We also run our gray water through there because it takes a lot of water to make wine. But these worms help break all that down. It helps clean our water. And we've been able to reuse about 3 million gallons of water every cycle, every harvest to, clean our tanks, put back into the vineyard, what have you. So it's little steps like that has been incrementally getting us further and further along to become a more self-sustaining kind of ecosystem.
Right, which is at the end of the day the goal for biodynamics. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's great. I think people don't really quite realize sometimes how how much this world actually functions on the or is dependent on functioning of little critters like worms and stuff. I mean, we've been so focused, obviously, the last year on viruses and stuff, but
Yeah.
there's a lot more to our own sort of ecodiversity out there that we are really dependent on that we don't actually see or consider on a regular basis. So, all right.
Oh, absolutely.
So I guess I said last question a second ago, but one little final question is, are you changing or making selections on grape varieties based on the climate change? Like, are you seeing a shift? Are you testing out different grapes based on the need to, combat, heat and water stress and all that kind of stuff?
That's one of the reasons that we have kind of a diverse array of grapes planted in our, because we want to see how they perform over time. Like, things have changed drastically from when Bonterra started to now, even in the 33 years that it's been.
Yeah.
And Jeff and Joseph, our director of viticulture, they are trying out different grape varieties. That's one reason we started using Petit Syrah. It does very well in these climates. Particularly as things get hotter. On the flip side, and literally, like, you go down south to Chile, Conchitoro has a very state-of-the-art innovative research center where they are doing research on drought tolerance of Cabernet clones. So everybody that is a big Pinot fan or Francophile knows about the clones of Pinot Noir, like Dijon, 777, so on or so forth, Pommard, Wadensville. Well, Cabernet has clones just like that, but it hasn't really gotten the genetic research that Pinot Noir has. And one of the steps that Conchitoro is taking is we have a big test vineyard down in Maule, which is pretty similar to Mendocino climatically.
Yep.
It's wet enough to dry farm, but it still has those spikes. It gets really hot in the summer and it's pretty mild winter. But what we're doing there is test plots of different Cabernet clones to identify which clone is going to perform better under drought conditions and under water stress. Thus, can we begin to graft our rootstock, pick our rootstock and then use this particular clone with this rootstock in vineyards that we know are going to have a water problem.
Yeah.
And it's little things like that Conchitoro, as well as, there's been a considerable amount of input from Joseph and Bonterra, with this project to look at just water stress in vineyards and how we can use the existing genetic material of the variety of clones that are out there that can help kind of shore us up so we can continue growing some of the classic varieties.
Which is going to be,
love.
yeah, exactly what I was going to say. People are still going to want to have Cabernet, and they're not necessarily
exactly
thinking about your clonal selection. They just wonder why you don't have Cabernet. It's like, well, it's too hot to
exactly.
grow Cabernet.
Yeah, exactly. There's always that component of there is what we want, what the environment really wants us to grow, but then what people will buy.
Right.
And there is a fine line that we can wade where, okay, if you get the right clonal material for a Cabernet for drought conditions, which is what we're seeing more and more in California, okay, well, we can still grow Cabernet instead of switching to something that, maybe like Petit Syrah that does better in those conditions typically, that people are like, I don't really want a full glass of Petit Syrah. It's a little much.
Yeah. No, I can imagine.
Small steps.
Yeah, I can imagine trying to change the shelving in some of the box stores or wine lists over from Cabernet to Petit Syrah. It's like, nah, not going to happen. So, all right, cool. I appreciate that. So, I read that Bonterra is the #1 selling organic brand in the United States. Is that the case? All right,
that's the case.
So you guys have done a good job. You've marketed it well, but backing it up with practices that make sure it carries forward. So appreciate it. Appreciate the time today.
My pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure. Absolutely, Brian. Cheers, everybody, and enjoy.
Thank you.